So today's topics are going to cover modeling public transit within Vissim. And you'll see this is usually referred to either as public transport in some locations, and then most of the time I'll usually just shorten this down to PT. First, we're going to go through all the attributes associated with public transit vehicles, and then we're going to go into more of the elements, so the PT stops, the lines, and the routes. And then finally, we're going to review some available options for some signal operations with public transit and also some public transit evaluations. So public transit elements really consist of the transit vehicles themselves, and then the stops are the stations that are going to be used by those transit vehicles. In Vissim, you'll see a lot of the stations themselves are going to be referred to as stops or PT stops. And then finally, we have the transit lines, which will be the terminology kind of used in Vissim, which are essentially the routes that those vehicles are going to use. So we're going to go through the setup involved with each of these, starting with those transit vehicles. So information about the transit vehicles all lives within the vehicle types list, which is found under that base data menu. And here there's going to be a few transit options created by default. There's usually a bus and then a tram option. However, you can add additional ones here if you maybe had a rail option you wanted to add, or maybe some different types of buses. You can create new vehicle types within here. And then all of the properties related to the transit vehicle itself can then be further edited. In this case, you can just double click that selected vehicle type, or you can select that pencil icon to further edit these. And then once you have that vehicle type window open, all of the transit settings are going to be found underneath the special tab within this window. And then down at the bottom is the section where you can click for PT parameters. And in here, this will really allow you to set that capacity for that vehicle. And you can also check if you want that to kind of enforce that capacity limit and don't allow any additional passengers to be able to board once that capacity has been reached. In this next section here, you can set up different alighting and boarding times. This is the time per passenger. And this is going to be used if you're using a calculation method to determine the dwell time. And we're going to talk more about that in a bit more detail a bit later. And then you can also choose how that total dwell time is calculated, whether it be the sum of the boarding and alighting times, or if it's just the maximum of those boarding and alighting times. And then you can also define the clearance time needed for any vehicle needed to stop, the time it'll take to open and close the doors, and then account for any other possible delays. And then finally, there's also a door closure duration, which is taken into account if you're using any VisWalk passengers with public transit. So there is one resource that can be used to assist with the passenger boarding and alighting time. And this can be found in the TRB Transit Cooperative Research Program Transit Capacity and Quality of Service Manual. So in here, this really contains some different passenger service times based on different types of payment situations. So you'll see some up here, so you can see, some recommended times if passengers are allowed to use a smart card or a magnetic strip card, or if they have to use exact change. And then some of the alighting times depend on some different door layouts. So you can see here if there's, just people are leaving at the front door or the rear door, or if they have kind of a smart card checkout that's involved. So here, these are just some suggested times that can be used if you are looking to model kind of that detailed passenger boarding and alighting time. All right, so the next element we're going to move on to here is for those public transit stops or adding in those different stations in the network. So first, here you'll select the public transport stops options from the Network Edit Objects toolbar. And then in order to add these, you can either just right-click on the link where you want to place that, and then you can select Add New Public Transport Stop. Or you can also just press Control and right-click to add that stop directly on the link itself. And when you have that stop added, it's going to look like this kind of maroon box that's up here in the top corner. And so by default, it's just going to be placed kind of on the street on that particular link. But there is also an option within Vissim if you do want to automatically move that to the lay-by stop configuration. So in this case, as long as you still have that public transport stops still highlighted, you can just right-click on the desired stop, and then you can choose the option for adding the lay-by stop. And what this will do is it'll automatically create all of the lay-by geometry for you. So it's going to add in the separate link and then a couple of connectors here to connect that to the main link. And then it's also going to add in a conflict area. And then it'll also automatically move that stop for you from the main link to that new geometry. So once a stop has been created, you'll then see this PT stop window will open up where you can further edit some of those attributes. So up at the top, we have the number and the name. If you have a particular numbering scheme, maybe you want to number these the same as they're in the field, you can go ahead and update those up here at the top. And then there's also a couple tabs. So the first one is for the base data, and that's going to contain information about the link, where that stop is located, and also the position on the link. And then it'll also have the length for that PT stop. And we recommend that those stops should be long enough to accommodate at least the length of the longest PT vehicle that's going to be using this stop. So within Vissim, you can always go into the vehicle model section if you want to see kind of how long those vehicles might be. If you're trying to measure for like a bus stop, you can check and see how long those buses are to make sure that stop will be long enough. And this is particularly needed, especially if you're using any VisWalk integration with pedestrians. You can also create these stops to accommodate multiple vehicles. In this case, you just want to make sure that stop, again, is long enough to cover the sum of those vehicle lengths and include some of the clearance distance between those vehicles. And then if you move over to the Boarding Passengers tab, this is where you can define any boarding passenger information within the stop itself. So in order to add a new row here within this window, you can just right-click and then select the Add option. And this will drop in a new row in this window. And this is where you can enter in the volume for the number of passengers that are going to be boarding. This will be entered as number of people per hour. And then you can also add in the from and the to time for which this number of boarding passengers is valid, along with the valid PT lines that should use this boarding passenger volume. So if you maybe had a couple of different lines that were using this particular stop, you can always add in additional rows and then turn on the corresponding row with that PT line here. Or the same thing too, if you maybe wanted to model a certain number of boarding passengers, maybe for 1 hour time period, and then for the next hour, if you wanted to change that, you can just continue to add more rows and then just further edit these fields until you have that desired configuration set up. Okay, so the next item we're going to go over to is for actually adding these PT lines to the network. So the public transit lines are really the public transit, what the vehicle inputs and the vehicle routes are to general traffic. So in this case, whenever we add in a public transit line, that's going to not only route the vehicles through the network, but it's also going to add them to the network as well. So you can kind of think of the PT lines as really kind of a combination of the vehicle inputs and the routes that are going to be used for these transit vehicles. So in order to add any of these PT lines to the network, first you can go over to the Public Transport Lines option from the Network Object toolbar. And then you can right-click on the link where you want to start those vehicles, that generation from. And then you can select the option for Add New Public Transport Line. And whenever you do that, that's going to place the starting point of the transit line here. So this will show up as like this dark blue point. And this is always going to be placed at the very beginning of a link. So no matter where you click, if you try to add it in the middle, it's always going to push it to the starting point, just like a vehicle input would, where they both kind of start at the very beginning of the link itself. And then in order to kind of complete that transit line, you'll just left click to place this network exit point here, which is shown in light blue. So you can, wherever the network is ending, you can just left click there to place that line endpoint. And then another option you can also do if you want to, if you don't want to use that context menu, is you can also just control and right click to place in that first blue starting point, and then you can just left click again to place that endpoint at the network exit. All right, so once a line has been added, you can then edit the attributes associated with that particular line. So just like stops, at the top we've got the number and the name for the line. And then this also contains a few different tabs. So if we start with the base data tab, here's where you can see the link that the line is going to be starting on. You can also select the vehicle type that should be generated. So here's where you can choose if you had a bus or a train. You can update that vehicle type here. And then you can also set the desired speed distribution that will be used when that vehicle enters the network. There's also an option for a time offset. So this can be used if you would like vehicles to kind of enter the network a little bit sooner than their scheduled departure time. And there's also an entry time distribution, which can be added if you would like to vary that arrival time. Since vehicles maybe aren't always on their schedule to a T, you can kind of use this if you want to add some variation to when those vehicles are going to enter the network. And then we also have a slack time fraction, which is really a wait time factor that can be used if you want to allow vehicles to kind of depart their stop early. So if this value is equal to 1, then those vehicles will wait and really depart according to their schedule. However, if this value is less than 1, that will allow the vehicles to depart earlier than their scheduled time. And then finally, you can also define the color of the vehicles using this particular PT line. So if you just click this color box here, this will allow you to update that color just so that you can easily see as the vehicles are going through the network, kind of which bus is associated with which line. All right, so if we move over to the Departure Times tab, this is going to allow you to enter the times that the vehicle will enter the network. So if you want to add a new row, you can just right-click in here and then select Add, or you can choose the option to generate start times. Add is really just going to create a single line item for you here, while the Generate Start Times will allow you to automatically create multiple entries all at once. So if you select that Generate Start Times, in this window, you can then choose to enter in that first departure time. So this will be the very first vehicle that will be placed on the network. Then you can add in the rate or the service frequency. And then finally, the very last departure time for the vehicle to enter the network. And then once you have all of that entered, you can select OK. And this will automatically create a list of all of these departure times in here. There's also some options as well where you can add in an optional course number. This is going to be used for PT telegrams. And then you can also enter an occupancy value as well. And this is really just the number of passengers that are already in the vehicle when it enters the network. So this is kind of can capture if you had, a bus is just entering the network, maybe it's already been to a few stops that are located off the network. You can really add just this occupancy value if you want to account for people that are already on this bus as it's being put onto the network. And then on the final tab here, this is for the PT telegram. And this is really where you can define different data that's going to be transmitted between the PT vehicle to different control procedures. So within Vissim, this communication really occurs whenever a vehicle passes a PT calling point that gets set up on the detectors themselves. But in this tab, this is where you can set up what kind of information gets transmitted. So here you can set up the line, route, priority, and vehicle length information. And again, this will get can be used in some external coding if you just kind of want to see information about these transit vehicles. So the PT line list is also a great tool for kind of checking and updating some of this data for the PT lines. So the PT lines contain a few different options for some of the related data. And all of this information can really be shown here in these different child lists that show up on the right-hand side. And in order to select any of these child list displays, you can just go to the drop-down item that's here at the top, and then you can choose the different options for that related data from here. So one of the really useful items here is for the line stops, which is shown here in this top window. But essentially, this is where you can see any of the different transit stops that particular line passes. And you'll also see here, too, whether those different stops are active or essentially for those vehicles to stop at. So you can just quickly see that information here and then also easily turn different stops on and off that are allowed by that transit line. In addition, you can also see some information about those departure times. So if you change that child list dropdown to departure times here, you'll just see a list of all those times that vehicle is going to enter the network. So this is the same information that was entered into the public transit line window, but this child list option just makes it a little bit easier to update and see those departure times. You can kind of scroll through the different transit lines over here if you just want to quickly check or make any updates to those departure times within this window. And then similar to vehicle routes, PT lines also contain an option for checking and fixing any of the lines if they do happen to get broken. So this can be particularly useful if you're maybe building up your network and you've created a whole bunch of lines, but then you realize you need to make a geometry change and maybe some of the links are getting moved or deleted. But in this case, you can go ahead and run this feature. You can just right-click in the network editor and then select check and fix all PT line routes. And that's going to just run through the procedure and find any of those broken routes for you and try to fix them and correct any of those missing linkages. All right, so now we've kind of covered all of the different required PT elements. We've taken a look at the vehicles, the stops, and then also the lines. So now we're going to take a look at some of the different calculation methods that can be used to determine this transit vehicle dwell time. So there are three different options. The first one here being the passenger demand model, which is really going to use information about the passenger boarding and alighting times, and also the number of passengers getting on and off each stop. So when you're using this particular method, you're going to need to add information to the PT vehicle type. So kind of that first item that we talked about here, this is where that calculation method comes into play. So this is where you can enter in the boarding and alighting time per passenger and kind of how that time is going to be added up. Then you'll also need to enter in that volume that can be found on that PT stop itself. And then finally, you'll also need to add in some information on the PT line stop. And we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail next. But in here, you'll see for the passenger demand model calculation. In this case, on the stop itself, you can choose that percentage of alighting passengers. So that's going to be the main item taken into account to kind of calculate how long that alighting time is going to be. So the second method here is a bit more simplified. This one just uses, is called the dwell time distribution. And so this is really just going to involve using a time distribution to calculate that dwell time. And the only information that's required for this particular method is going to be, again, back on that PT line stop. In this case, we can choose a dwell time to use a distribution. So in this case, you can just select the particular time distribution from the drop-down here. And that's what's going to be used to calculate the amount of dwell time that's used for that transit vehicle at its stop. And then the final method we have here is going to involve VisWalk. So in this case, the calculations are going to be completed using a pedestrian model that's going to be set up. You can add in different platforms for the transit stops. You can add in the different pedestrians and also create routes for them. This is a bit more detailed modeling effort. So unfortunately, we won't be covering the details of this in this case. But we are planning on starting a VisWalk webinar series over the next couple of months. So just keep a lookout for that. And that webinar is going to go into a lot more detail about all of the related VisWalk objects and all of the setup required for this. All right, so the next thing we're going to go and turn our attention to is the PT line stops. So this is where that stop-specific data can be accessed for each PT line. So in order to access this, there's a couple of different ways. The first is to select the PT line from the network editor, or you can select it from the PT line list. Then once you have that line itself selected, you can then double click on any of the PT stops. And you'll see here in the image that the PT stops, when you kind of have that line selected first, these are going to show up either with a red box or a green box. And if the PT stop is active and turned on for this line, you'll see it show up as a red box, whereas if the stop is not active and it's kind of a passive stop, you'll see that shown in green. And then again, the second way that you can access this line stop data is if you go back to that public transport line list, and then you can change that child list to line stop. And again, here's where you can see that active check mark here, where you can update the active stops for a particular line through this interface as well. So if you do double click on one of these stops, this is going to open up the PT line stop window, and this will just allow you to further edit some of the stop information. Up at the top is again where that stop is active, so you can choose if you want to turn this stop on or off. You can also allow skipping if there are no passengers going to be boarding or lighting at that particular stop. You can also set up a departure time offset in case that transit vehicle should be allowed to depart earlier from its scheduled time. And then you can also set up any additional dwell time that's due to any of the doors locking. And then finally down here at the bottom, we've got a dwell time where we can set up based again on that dwell time method. So if you're using that time distribution method, here's where you can choose the distribution from the drop-down list. Otherwise, if you are going to be calculating the dwell time using that demand passenger model, you can choose the calculation option here and then update the alighting percentage of passengers that will be getting off at this stop. Okay, so since the PT lines are really a fixed path, they basically have their start and their end point. And if you do ever need to have maybe transit vehicles temporarily change their route midline, or maybe they take a slightly different path during a different time of day, you can set up some different partial PT routes. And essentially what this will do is it'll allow vehicles to enter the network as they would normally on their PT line. Then as they travel and they pick up this new partial PT route, they will then travel along that route until they complete that one. And then they're going to return back to their line and just use that for the remainder of their trip. And then just, go back to that original path. So again, this can be really useful if maybe you've got vehicles that, again, need to just change part of their journey in the middle, maybe for a particular time period during the simulation. And then you want to switch that back and just have them use the line again afterward. So in order to add this, first you'll go over to the vehicle routes option in the network objects toolbar. And if you hover over that, you'll see there's a little drop-down icon here. And in this case, you can select partial PT. And then once you have that selected, you can then just place the routes like you normally would for a static route. So you can either use that context menu to place the start point, or you can press Control and right-click to place that start point, and then the endpoint can be added in with a left click. And then if you do need to edit either the path for this partial PT route or for the PT lines themselves, a lot of this editing is done just like it is for a static route. And the PT lines themselves will also probably need to be edited if you did add in any of those lay-by stops. If you kind of shifted the the stops from the street themselves into that lay-by configuration. In that case, you'll also probably need to slightly adjust that line to make sure it travels over that lay-by stop. But all of this can be done by either selecting the line or the route that you want to edit. And then you can just press Control and right-click to add any intermediate points along that line or that route. And then you can just click and drag that intermediate point from one location to the next, and that will go ahead and move that line or route to that desired location. And then you can just click on an empty area just to kind of confirm and lock that new line or route path in place. Okay, so our next topic that we're going to move over to is taking a look at some different signal operations that can be used with public transit. So within any of the RBC controllers, you can add some information for either transit signal priority and for preemption. So the controllers themselves, if you go ahead and open up and edit the signal controllers and get into that RBC window, you'll see here on the left side in this tree view window, there's going to be a couple of different options, one for the for TSP and then one for preemption. And you can go ahead and just click either of those options, or you can expand them. And either of those will then bring up the related tables for each of those options. And then from here, you can go ahead and add in any of the related information for TSP or for preemption. And then public transit can also be used with some of the external signal controllers, such as Econolite ASB3. And then for either of these cases, you can also set up signal heads to only be active for specific vehicle types. So if you do edit a particular signal head, there's a vehicle class section down here at the bottom. And this is where you can uncheck all vehicle types, and then you can click the allowed options here on the right. So you can choose if you wanted to have the signal head only be active for a bus or for a train. You can choose those options within this window here. And then only those specific vehicle types will see the signal head and take the state into account. And then finally, we also have some special configuration that can be done for transit on the detectors themselves. So the first option here is for the detector type. So if you select the type from the dropdown, here's where you can choose that PT calling PT. So this is really that PT calling point, which can be used if you're trying to record any vehicles that send those PT telegram information. You can also configure the vehicle classes that are allowed, just like those signal heads. So you can change the option here from all vehicle types to a specific vehicle type. You can also change the available PT lines that the detector would be valid for. And then down at the bottom is an option here for turning on some departure signal option. So whenever this is activated, this is typically used for any near side stops where that PT stop is really located really closely to the signal head. In this case, you can really hook up that detector and kind of connect it to a particular PT stop number. So you can choose the PT stop here from the drop down. And then you can place a call automatically before that departure time. So essentially, whenever the vehicle is kind of done or almost done its boarding and alighting process, Vissim is going to take a look at the time before departure. And at that time, that a call will be placed and kind of triggered for this particular detector. And so now we're going to move over to our final section here for the PT evaluation. And for this section, we're going to be going back to the evaluation configuration window. And all the public transit evaluations can really be recorded for all the standard evaluations that we've talked about in the past. So if you would like to record any maybe transit-specific information, up at the top of this window is where you can select the desired vehicle class from the vehicle classes section up at the top. And then you can configure the evaluations just like you normally would. You can turn on or off different options for collecting data. And then you can also set again that from and to time and that time interval. And then once the simulation is running, if you do have a particular vehicle class selected, when you go to view any of the results, you'll see some different column settings here. So you'll see again the results for all of the vehicle classes, and then you'll also see some separate ones based on the filter options you have set. So in this case, you'll see we've got the number of vehicles here for buses, as well as the bus-specific travel time and the bus distance traveled. So this is just a good way if you want to kind of pull out any transit-specific information just from the kind of regular set of evaluations. And in addition, there are some other direct outputs that can be used for the public transit vehicles. The first one here being the public transport waiting time. So if we go over to that direct output tab, you can just check that right to file option for the public transport waiting time. And if this is selected, you can record data in an external file, and this will contain information like the simulation time, the vehicle number, the line that it's on, as well as the link location. And then you'll also see here at the very end is the duration, and this is going to really record any particular wait times. And this is going to account for any wait times that a transit vehicle is going to incur that's not related to any boarding or lighting or any time from stopping at the stop sign. So it's going to really take into account any times outside of those few cases. And any of this information can then be read into an external program. You can bring it into Excel if you want to kind of further aggregate this data and then maybe kind of determine some overall wait time information. You could then aggregate it by line if you're interested in, if maybe a particular line is experiencing a lot of extra wait time, and then you can kind of further dig into that using something like Excel just to kind of aggregate that data a bit more. And then the second option for recording data can also be found within the vehicle record. So if you have that option selected, in here you can also select the More option here. And this will allow you to filter by vehicle class. So again, you can select the particular transit vehicles you're looking at. And then you can select the attribute list down at the bottom. And this will allow you to collect data for transit-specific attributes. So some related attributes would include, you can collect like the simulation time, some of the vehicle information, the vehicle position, and the distance traveled. Then you can also look at the PT line and stop information in more detail. And this is also going to print out to an external file like the waiting times. So a lot of this information can again be brought into Excel if you wanted to perform any additional analysis, maybe create some other plots like a time-space diagrams, so you can kind of determine some of the bottleneck areas in the network. So this really covers all of the presentation material. So we've kind of taken a look at the transit elements that are needed, as well as how some of the evaluations and signals can be kind of set up. So from here, we can go ahead and take a look at our example file. All right, so in here, again, we'll be providing this after the training today, but in here we've got a couple of different transit stops set up, as well as a couple of different lines. So I'll go ahead and open up that transit line list here. We've got kind of one for the westbound direction and one for the eastbound direction. And you'll see if you open up that transit lines list, you can then click on either of these, and this will kind of highlight that entire area for you, as well as show you which stops are active for that particular line. Again, if you do want to remove a stop, so if you didn't want a particular line to stop there, you can always uncheck that option in this child list window. Again, you'll see here for anything that's not active, that's just going to show up as a green box, whereas anything that is active is going to show up here as a red box. And then again, further attributes can be adjusted for any of these PT line stops. As long as you have that line kind of selected, you can just double click on any of those, and that's going to bring up this line stop window. It'll show you more information about which line you've got selected, as well as that PT stop. And then here's where you can really change if you wanted to update the select the distribution required for the dwell time, Or again, you can use that calculation method if you kind of want to use that passenger demand model to calculate the waiting time within Vissim. So let's go ahead and we can just go through an example of creating another stop in a line. So I'll go over to the public transport stop option here, and then I'll just control and right click to add in a new transit stop. And again, here, if you wanted to add in any boarding passenger information, here's where you can add in those different options. So again, you could maybe create, if you had some different numbers of passengers that you had boarding the vehicle at particular times, you can kind of update those if you want that to be taken into account in here. And then you'll also, again, just want to make sure that the PT stop is the appropriate length for those vehicles so that you can make sure that that vehicle can fit on that stop. And in this case, let's go ahead and move the stop a bit closer to that stop bar. And then I'll go ahead and add in one of those public transport lines. So again, I'll just right click, control and right click to place that start point. And you'll see as soon as we place that, it kind of automatically tags itself to the start of that link. And then again, you can just select the network exit point for this particular stop location. And once you have that line created, again, this is where you can choose that vehicle type. So if you had maybe a different type of bus or a train that you're adding in, you can select that from the dropdown. And then you can also enter in the desired speed distribution that will be used for that vehicle as it enters the network. And then in order to actually place these vehicles onto the network, in the departures times tab, this is where you can generate some of those start times. So again, I'll just right click on here and just generate start time. And this will allow you to start, choose when you want that first vehicle to be added, as well as the rate, and for how long you want those vehicles to be placed in the network. So in this case here, every 200 simulation seconds, we'll get a new bus placed into the network on this particular line. And then once you have everything kind of filled out in here, you can just press OK. And in this case, since we did place this particular stop pretty close to that signal head, kind of on top of this detector, this is where in the detector you can go to that activation tab here if you kind of want to set up that departure signal option. So if you kind of want this detector to be triggered before that vehicle is going to depart. So in this case, I'll just go back and take a look here. We've got public stop number 2633. So in this case, if we go back here to the detector window, this is where we can select that PT stop number here. And then you can enter in the time before departure that you want this kind of detector to be called. And then kind of the final thing, again, that we can set up here is on the line itself. So you can see here we've got on this public transit line, as soon as we added it, it did pick up any of the stops that this line kind of falls over and kind of set those to active for us. You can also just double click on any of these if you wanted to set those inactive. And then again, for these as well, here's where you can set dwell time. In this case, I'll just set it up for distribution, just so that those vehicles will dwell for distribution rather than setting up that calculation time. But again, if you did want to kind of use that passenger demand method to set up the kind of that dwell time calculation, in this case for the PT line stop, you'll just want to change this to the calculation method and then change that alighting percentage. And then in the vehicle type list, again, this is where you can change those PT parameters. So this is where you can set up those boarding and alighting times for the passengers in much more detail if you wanted to use that calculation method instead. All right, so from here we can go ahead and play the simulation. And we've got a pretty high frequency of buses entering the network here at this new location. So we should start to see some of those immediately. And again, these are just going to be colored based on how you have that line color set up. And you'll see here when the bus is dwelling, it's going to show up with a white kind of mark filled in. You can also get more information about the buses themselves. So let me see. Here's another bus that's coming on a separate line. That's going to stop here. So in this case, you can select any of those vehicles, and they will have some attributes associated with them for their transit line. So you can see the dwell time. You'll see here there's a couple options for public transit, dwell, current, and the total, which will show up. You can also just get the regular dwell time if you want to just kind of count down and see kind of how long that vehicle's been at that particular stop. You can also use this to get information about if it was on a partial PT route or on a line, you can get some of the line information as well as the stop information too. And in here in the quick view window, that's where some of that information will show up. And you'll see here that dwell time is going to count down as the vehicle is sitting there and dwelling. All right, so that kind of goes over most of the main elements. Again, if you are looking to calculate any particular evaluations, a lot of that transit-specific ones can be set up in the evaluation configuration menu. This is where you can select a vehicle, a transit-specific vehicle class, if you want some of those results to show up for just this particular vehicle class. And then again, you can also set up some of those direct outputs if you want to use those for any further kind of raw data collection, and then you can use those to aggregate the information or create some additional charts and graphs.